Hi, and welcome to the Storytellers Project. My name is Megan Finnerty, and I am so excited you're here on behalf of the USA Today Network and my whole team at the Storytellers Project. You guys know that normally we're doing shows all across America, and we have more than 100 shows in maybe 20 cities. But right now, because of the coronavirus pandemic, we know it doesn't feel safe to be inside theaters, but it does feel right to be with each other virtually. So this is part of our new virtual season. And this evening, we are going to join leaders, authors, journalists, thinkers, and doers with a storytelling show dedicated to lessons learned. We promise there are going to be some lessons learned the hard way if you enjoy that kind of thing. I'm really excited to be here this evening. We're going to bring them up right now so you can say hi. Are you ready to meet our storytellers? Diana Nanez is a senior reporter at the Arizona Republic, which is part of the USA Today Network, and my former colleague. Hi, Diana. Kelly Buffalo Quinn is an organizer, and she's a member of the Meskwaki tribe. She's based in Des Moines, and she's a previous teller from our nights there. Hi. Erin Myers Madeira is out of Pacific Grove, California, and she works for the Nature Conservancy. One of her jobs is to build strong collaborations between the conservation organization and Indigenous people around the world. So thanks for being here, Erin. Michael Heller is one of our Storytellers team members. He's the head of brand partnerships. So if you ever want to work with us, or you just want to call and say, thanks for doing these shows, Michael could answer the phone. Thanks for being here. And Jim Tankersley, he's coming to us from outside of Washington, D.C., where he is an economics reporter for the New York Times and author of a new book, The Riches of This Land. Thanks for being here, Jim. So if you're a regular watcher or you're a brand new person to the show, we want to tell you what this is and what this isn't. Tonight is not a TED Talk, not a Toastmasters, not a how-to, not an inspirational speech. The only thing we are going to try to sell you is literally maybe a subscription to a local paper. We ask instead that you pay attention and open your heart, because storytelling is about visiting. And you know how to visit. Like, you get curious about a person. You want to feel closer to them. You open your heart. You open your mind. You kind of think like, have I ever walked in this person's shoes? And we really invite you to do that tonight and feel closer to these 5 people. Some of these stories are going to be conversational. Some are going to be super casual. Others are going to be polished and professional. And that matters because we've coached the storytellers on their narrative arcs, but we don't coach them on how to be themselves. That's really part of the storytelling process, is them being their real self and you getting to experience that. We know creating empathy and understanding is vital at all times, and it is especially vital during times like these filled with so much uncertainty. So it is our honor and our joy to do that with you this evening. I am excited to welcome up our first storyteller, Jim Tankersley. Jim has a story about changing a question he'd always asked himself.
Thanks, Megan. So excited to be here, and thanks for letting me tell my story. You know, most kids don't grow up wanting to be an economics reporter, and I certainly didn't. It was not my goal. But looking back, I think there were some signs that maybe it was in the cards for me. I was the only kid I knew who took the players on his stuffed animal baseball teams and imputed them into a database on his Apple computer. And for that matter, the only kid I know who spent a lot of time playing a game on that computer called Lemonade Stand, which was basically just supply and demand over and over and over in the course of the summer, when you learn the right pricing for how to sell lemonade to kids on hot days. But I think really maybe the thing that drove me most to my job was just being a kid in Western Oregon in the 1980s and the 1990s, and watching an entire economic ladder snap out from underneath the kids I went to high school with. Oregon has been a timber state for a long time, but in the 80s and 90s, the industry basically collapsed. And the guys I went to high school with, who so often had dads or moms who worked in the industry, in the woods or in the mills or in the connected supply businesses, suddenly a blue-collar, good-paying, middle-class pathway that had been open to those kids who weren't going to go to a 4-year college was taken away almost overnight as the industry cratered around them. And I thought about that a lot. I think way more than I might have expected from a teenager or even a preteen. And I think a big reason why is because one other sort of weird thing about me as a kid. I was the kid who in church, in our Episcopal church, would, when the sermon started going long, thumb through the back of the prayer book, which had some pretty amazing poetry, basically, of prayers for various occasions. And one that really stuck with me was called The Prayer for the Oppressed. And it ends with an exhortation to the Lord to help all people receive their fair share of the riches of this land. And for me, I spent a childhood and adolescence wondering, when are the kids I go to high school with going to get their fair share? When is the economy going to start working for these guys who have watched their opportunity dry up? Now, fast forward, I left my largely white hometown. I went to college. I got a job, and I started moving across the country. I was a political reporter in Ohio, and I was about to become a father, and I was chasing a Senate candidate and a gubernatorial candidate all around the state. And I found myself in one of those Ohio river towns that has been sort of husked out by the deindustrialization of the Midwest. It was a sort of place where a crowd had gathered and on a sparkly day along the Ohio River. And they were all waiting for a politician to come out. And he was going to tell them the only thing they really wanted to hear, which was, how was he going to bring the good jobs back? And I started listening to that politician and the answers he was giving, and I realized something. He didn't have real answers. He was just selling them the same warmed over platitudes they'd heard for a really long time. And it set me off on a quest, an expanded version of that childhood question, which now encompassed far more workers in America, which was, when will the good jobs come back? When will the American economy start working again for the people, the working people who built our middle class? So a few years later, I'm living in Washington. Now I work for a magazine, and I'm a full-time economics reporter for the first time in my career. And as part of my job, I spent a lot of time reading through arcane economics research, hoping to find scoops buried in the equations. In this particular moment, I was in my office, which was in the Watergate office building, not the famous Nixon one, but just a couple over. And I found this paper with a really dry title that almost slapped me across the face. It was called "The Allocation of the Allocation of Talent and U.S. Economic Growth," which doesn't sound like a barn burner, but it had this wild finding at the core of it, which was that essentially everything that I thought I knew about the American middle class, the things I had been told in my largely white high school, was incomplete, and that a huge driver, 40% of America's growth since 1960, came not from Leave It to Beaver type ward cleavers coming home into their white families in the suburbs, but from the entry of women and of Black men into the workforce and into opportunities they had been barred from for their entire lives, for the entirety of America. Basically, until 1960, almost all of the high-skilled, high-paying jobs in the country were walled off to everyone except white men. And then in the aftermath of a war effort that had pulled women into necessary jobs and had gotten them into the labor force, and then in the hard struggle of civil rights, Americans who had been denied opportunity started to win it. And when they did, an amazing thing happened, which was the entire economy worked better. When you have talented people who have been kept out of deploying their talents to their full extent for so long, and you finally let them do that, it turns out to be really good for how your economy grows. And when it grows fast and unemployment is low, like it was at that time, you get sustained income growth, which pulled millions of Americans into the middle class. And I realized, hey, I've been asking the wrong question this whole time. It's not just when is the economy going to work for the guys I went to high school with or the people of Ohio. It's when is the economy going to start working again for everyone? And where are we going to find the people who can make it work that way again? Where is that new realm of opportunity? And I found it, at least in a microcosm, in a man named Ed Green. Now it's the last day of the minor league baseball season in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, start of September. And my son is now 7, and he has come with me to meet this tall Black man who was walking down the concourse to shake our hands and tell us about what is now his second full-time job of the day. Ed had gotten up before dawn to lay tar on a highway for the state of North Carolina, and now he was a custodian for the Winston-Salem minor league baseball team who scrubbed soda out of the concrete. He spent some time telling my son why that was so difficult. And then my son spent the rest of the game telling me not to spill our sodas. So I met Ed and I wrote about him, a man who had once had a good middle-class job, had to give it up, and now had to work 2 full-time jobs just to give his kids the middle-class lifestyle that he wanted for them, that the American economy used to deliver, but had stopped delivering for workers like Ed. And I wrote about him in a story for the Washington Post, and then we kept in touch. And over time, I learned that Ed's family was in fact a perfect encapsulation of this middle-class rise and fall in America. His mother had grown up in one of 16 kids in Winston-Salem and had made her way north in the Great Migration. And she and his father had worked hard and built a middle-class life in Queens, New York for their kids. And now Ed, who had not gone to college, was being kicked backwards by an economy that first had just shifted out from under him. And then, the last time we talked, he was starting to see signs of discrimination reforming, of new barriers being thrown up for Black men, for women of all races, that are holding our economy back. And this normally would be the part of an economics reporter's time with you, where he would tell you how we fix all this. Because the great news in Ed's story, in the American story, is I've learned by changing my focus, by asking this question about all workers, that we have the raw materials right here for another middle-class golden age like we had after World War II. We just need to empower workers like Ed and like his children. We need more women working and in higher value jobs and getting paid more for what they're worth. And we need more immigrants and workers of color to be able to have the opportunities that white men do. And I would like to tell you that's going to be easy, but actually it's going to be really hard. I basically have concluded that the single best thing that we could do as a country for our economy, let alone for the justness of where we live, is to sustain and finish the work of civil rights to end systemic racism and sexism. But I know that's not a 5-point plan. That's not something you're going to hear from a politician on a stump speech as an easy way to fix things. And I'll tell you, I actually think that one of the most important lessons I've learned in my life is that that's okay. And I learned it in college from a man who also embodies the type of progression that I've just been talking to you about. His name was Bill Wu, and he was the son of a Chinese immigrant to America, and he had risen to become the editor-in-chief of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch newspaper, but he had retired, and he taught my intro to journalism class. And Bill would spend hours regaling us with stories of the right way to do journalism and the right way to be a human being. And he would scrawl notes in our assignments, which I've kept, all of them, because they were so much wisdom. And like that prayer book from so long ago, it was like poetry. And the one that I think of every day that was scrawled at the end of an assignment I had turned in, Bill told me that he hoped I held something with me always. There are no quick fixes ever for the things we hold dearest. Thank you. That's my lesson learned.
Oh, Jim, that is a big finish. Thank you so much for your story. Thank you for your sincerity. Thank you for your research. It's a lot to consider, and yet it was such a basic question that so many of us, I'm sure, can relate to, which is, when are things going to get better for people like me, people like my neighbors, whoever those people might be?
Yeah. Thanks, Megan.
Thank you. Well, you guys, as an intense lesson from Jim. So, I don't want to be glib about it because, as he said, the real work is all the work for us and our hands. But I really appreciate that big idea in his story, which is that it is work we can do together. With that, at this point in our show, we always are lucky to thank our national sponsor, Humana. Humana has been sponsoring Storytellers Project shows for more than a year now in real life. But they've stayed with us virtually because they believe that sharing stories makes for healthier people and healthier communities. And they know that we need these connections to each other and to our health now more than ever. So as the pandemic continues to change and shift, Humana has remained steadfast in their commitment to the health, safety, and well-being of the people and the community it serves. And they are not joking. Their website has so many tips and ideas on it for how to avoid loneliness and how to stay healthy, even if you're separate from people. They've really made a commitment. So to check out more of what they have there, you can go to Humana.com, or you could just send them a note and say, thanks for sponsoring Storytellers. With that, we'd like to welcome up our next teller. Erin has a story about a walk that changed her life. Take it away.
Thanks, Megan. So I know we're not flying much these days, but that wasn't the case a little while ago. And I'm going to have you join me a few years ago. I was on a flight from LAX to Melbourne, Australia. You know, I'd put on my compression socks, was digging out my noise-canceling headphones, and settling in for the 16-hour flight. Now, I took a deep breath and I looked out the window, and as I started to decompress from the week, tears started to well up in my eyes. You know, the lead up to big trips there's always a lot going on, but this one seemed particularly stressful. I mean, there was digging out the field clothes, realizing that I needed new boots, but it's the things that you can't put on a checklist that were hardest. Now, I have always traveled for work, and so my children have grown up with it. But now that my daughter was approaching 4 and could articulate just how much she didn't want me to go and why, it was just becoming so much harder. And the irony is that one of the greatest gifts of motherhood has been to get really clear on my work in the world. And I am so grateful to do what I do. And I am so grateful to be a mom. Now, 4 years earlier, I was not yet a mom, but I was 42 weeks pregnant. Now, we all know how this works, right? 40 weeks. So I'm 42 weeks pregnant, and I was starting to truly believe that I might be the first person ever who would be steady state pregnant. Like, this baby was never going to come. I was never going to see my toes again. I was never going to be able to put on a sock by myself. And I was ready. It had been a really hard pregnancy. And I was also just ready to not have a hiccuping baby in my belly, you know, not have to get up and pee every 30 minutes during the night. And finally, she was ready too. And she arrived, and she was full of resilience and energy and opinions, like opinions from go. And she was healthy, and she was perfectly healthy. Now, during pregnancy, you learn a lot about the umbilical cord, but it all was sort of theoretical. Like, I had never seen one. And I'm watching the umbilical cord as it's still attached to both of us, and it's pulsating with love and life and mystery. And in that moment, I realized that, like it or not, we are literally tied to our parents and our grandparents and everyone who's come before us. And we are tied to our children and our grandchildren and everyone who will come after us. And in that moment, I was filled with this upwelling of gratitude and awe. I was so grateful for my parents and grandparents, everyone who'd come before me, what they had to overcome, the choices they made, the good, the bad, the wisdom they'd accrued, the idiosyncrasies they passed down, you know, all of it that came together, and just awe for the unlikelihood of all those chance encounters, that everything that had to happen to make this moment, my life and my daughter's life, possible. And as they cut the cord and put that squirmy, bright blue-eyed baby on my chest, I knew that part of my role during my time in this, you know, much larger continuum was to create a future where our children can thrive. Now, that commitment was not just to my daughter and to those who my umbilical cord tethers me to, but to all of those that we share this land with. We're all in this together, always have been, and always will be. Now, that realization didn't change everything at once, and spending time on the land with Indigenous elders has really helped me understand what that means for me. On this particular trip, after Melbourne, I was going to continue on west to Broome, Australia, and then drive to Nicanamungla country, where I was going to meet up with Linda Nardea, who is one of those elders I've learned so much from. I was part of a team at the Nature Conservancy supporting the Nicanamungla to advance their vision for their lands and their future. And Linda was one of the leaders in that community. Now, Linda and I, we are about the same age, but she's a grandmother and I'm a mother. And Linda has dedicated her life to passing down the culture and language and sense of responsibility for how to care for the land to the next generation. On this trip, Linda and I were walking and she was pointing out in the cliffs where her ancestors reside. We were accompanying this Aboriginal ranger crew and she was instructing them on these are the protocols for how you address the ancestors. And also really practically how you do traditional burning, how you care for the medicinal plants. And as we're walking, we were talking about just this responsibility to the next generation. And, we're sounding like we're in agreement. But I realized that, we meant it in a bit of a different way. So as we're walking, she elbowed me and pointed down to our feet. Now there's this like hard packed orange dirt and these really dry, brittle shrubs and brambles, and Linda's walking barefoot. Meanwhile, I'm in my new laced up boots with my, socks tucked over my pants. And she asked, "Do you know why I can walk barefoot?" Because the land knows me. She reaches up to protect my feet because I take care of her. And she pointed at my boots and said, "She doesn't know you yet. You need to wear boots." That it's not rhetorical for Linda. With every step she takes, she's reinforcing this caring, long-standing relationship with the land. Now, Linda's relationship with the land is so powerful and so unique. And in Nicanamungla country, the land and the people have been caring for each other for 50,000 years. That's something I will never know. And yet, at the same time, she stirred a remembrance in me, because there's something universally human about being in relationship with your place. I was brought to a place that my feet do know, where I can feel the sand between my toes and the cool breeze on my cheeks. It's a place where my parents and my grandparents took me, and where I now take my children to look for crabs and watch for shooting stars and to just sit and listen and be. And as I was struck by kind of that fundamental truth as we looked at our feet, I also felt gypped. I felt hoodwinked, because so much of my training and my career was about understanding and communicating our relationship and our responsibility to our lands and waters. But from this lens of like Western science and management, I use terms like economic value, monetizing carbon, biodiversity richness, and ecosystem services. And I could be really precise, but it had gotten so impersonal. One of Linda's many gifts to me has been to help me remember how deeply personal my work is. It's about me and my children, our future and our history and the land. And as Linda and I stood there and looked down at our feet, I realized that a healthy future for my children, for all our children, meant that I needed to change how I thought about myself in the world. I needed to be in relationship with the land and really, truly recognize how much we are part of each other. And I am so grateful to Linda and other elders who have shown me and continue to show me what it means to walk in the world in this way. Thank you.
Erin, thank you so much for your story. Thank you for this thoughtfulness. Thank you so much for introducing us to these people who lived all the way across the world and yet like have so much that I'm sure so many of us can relate to. That idea of the land holding her foot, what a beautiful and universal thought.
Well, thank you. I wish you all had a chance to walk with Linda, but I'm glad you got to meet her a little bit tonight. Thanks.
I do too. Although you did a good job describing her, I am carrying her with me a little bit in my heart. But Erin, thank you so much for your story.
Thank you.
I hope when you guys were listening, you were thinking of the places in the world that hold you up. You know, like I'm from Lake Michigan, and when Erin was talking about her home, her emotional home, I was definitely thinking about that place. With that, I'd like to take a minute to thank our local market sponsor. We're really excited to have MediaCom here. Here's how this works. In the normal times, MediaCom sponsors our Des Moines Storytellers event, and it's a big deal. They have huge shows, like 1,300 people come to shows 6 times a year, and we really appreciate their support. They have a cool thing called Xstream, and it makes their internet super fast, but what we know matters most is that they connect everyday people to the other people, places, ideas, and things that matter most right now through the internet. And we appreciate their connection to the Storytellers Project because they have been a huge supporter, and that's allowed that project to truly flourish in the greater Des Moines area. So really thankful to MediaCom. And if you live in the region, they used to tape all the shows and air them on TV stations all throughout the Midwest. So we appreciate them sticking with us during this new virtual season, and we look forward to being back with them in real life in Des Moines. And speaking of which, our Des Moines brothers and sisters, they're at the Des Moines Register. They've brought us our next storyteller. I'm really excited. Oh, sorry, it's Michael. Michael's our next storyteller. I was skipping ahead of my head. Michael, as you guys know, is our colleague, and he is coming to us from his house in Phoenix. He's going to tell us a story about saying goodbye to a friend.
Thanks, Megan.
Mm-hmm.
So it was nighttime when we landed, and I don't recall exactly how late it was because the flight had just lasted almost 20 hours. But I turned to the gentleman sitting next to me, with whom I just shared the entire flight from Chicago to India, and I wished him well on his adventures. His name was Tim, and he was a Green Beret, and he shared with me all these wonderful stories during the flight about fighting different insurgents, famous people he protected, and just this whole host of really funny stories. He handed me his business card and he said, "This has my sat phone on it in case you ever need it." And I remember holding this card like a lifeline, like a get out of jail free card. I'd imagine a team of Navy SEALs dropping from a helicopter with like night vision goggles to save me if I was ever in trouble. Now, the first thing you notice when you arrive in India for the first time is the smell. It's so pungent, and it's not like anything you've ever experienced. And it instantly let me know that I wasn't anywhere close to home. And in fact, I was about, I think, 8,000 miles or so from home. And I could feel my anxiety rising really quickly, like my blood was running the Kentucky Derby and my heart was in the press box calling the race. And it really took me a second to remember why I was there, because my best friend had taken his life 3 weeks prior. And I was there in India to bury him on the Ganges River. Now, the first time I thought I was going to die on this trip was in a taxi. In India, the rules of the road are, let's just say there are no rules on the road, but there is a lot of honking, lots and lots and lots of honking. And I spent the first night in a hotel just so I could get like adjusted and acclimated. And it was a little bit upscale. And when I got settled, I remember the first thing I thought was, Doug, my friend, would definitely not approve of this. See, we had grown up in the same privileged town, but we did not grow up the same. And I always felt a little bit like each of us had a little of what the other wanted. He wanted a family that would sit down and eat dinner together and support one another. And I wanted his freedom and his fearlessness. And I just wanted to be free of the anxiety I had of always doing and trying to be in the right place or do the right thing in those moments. I immediately checked out of that hotel in the morning, and I jumped on the first plane to Varanasi or Benares. It's called the City of Death. It's one of the oldest cities on Earth, and a lot of people pilgrimage there to bury their loved ones, if they're able to do so. But for a 6'5" Jewish kid from Chicago, I definitely stood out, and I felt really out of place. So I'd rented a small room along the banks of the Ganges River. And it was close to where I would perform this ceremony called a Santi Puja, or soul release. And I can tell you, my soul felt like it needed a release every second I was there. See, as much as I felt like I was on an adventure to bury my friend and do right by him, or basically to honor his last wishes, I had to that point basically lived how I felt like I was supposed to. I was always kind of afraid of pursuing my own dreams and often my own feelings. And I remember that evening stepping out to take a walk and take some photos, and I'm instantly surrounded by a huge group of people tugging at me and yelling at me. And in a panic, I ran back to my hotel. But I remember in that moment that I just felt that I had failed. I felt like a fraud. I felt like I was not going to be able to do this, to get through this moment, to rise up to the occasion. So I got my things together, calmed down, and I later went for a walk, and things were better. But during that moment, I remember that time in my room, I remembered I had a job to do, and I was there to do it. And I got really, really straight with myself on what my intention was and why I was there. And so in the morning I woke up, and I was supposed to meet a pujari to do the ceremony. He was nowhere to be found. And so yet again, I'm just faced with this overwhelming sense of panic that the whole reason I'm there is just not going to come to fruition. And so I had this very brief conversation with a concierge, this wonderful gentleman at the front of the hotel. And I'm instantly ushered out this side door and onto the back of this tiny little motorcycle with a person I have never met in my entire life before. And we're flying through the streets of Varanasi. We're passing cows and children playing, and we're going to a place I don't know about. I've never been there before. And I'm on one. So we finally arrive at this small little temple on the outskirts of town. I walked into this temple. I'm instructed to take my shoes off and sit and wait for the pujari to arrive. And so in he walks, he comes in, this older gentleman, and he introduces himself. And he just instantly asks me, really concertedly, he says, "Tell me your story. Why would a white man come here to do a Santi Puja? What would bring you such a long distance?" And so I began to tell him my story. And in that moment, it begins to really resonate with me. The real reason why I'm there. See, I was absolutely there to do right by my friend, but I was also there to make peace with the moment myself. And I just needed to find peace with this moment and this new reality I was faced with. And being there was absolutely my way of doing that, to make peace with this new reality. And so as we began to communicate, we then began to negotiate. And that found me in this really interesting position because I had never negotiated a funeral before. And as I'm feeling overcome with emotion, I actually found myself overwhelmed with anger that I'm being taken to the bank for this amount of money to do a Santi Puja. And it was interesting because in doing so, I actually reached a point where there was nothing more important than following through on my friend's wishes. And this is a really pivotal moment for me because in that moment, I stopped caring about my insecurities and allowing my fear to take over. And I just began to feel empowered by my mission. And so I told the pujari, I said, very honestly, you're either going to be a part of my story or you're not. This is the amount of money I have, and this is what I'd like to do. Let me know if you want to be part of my story. And he nods. And then he hugged me and he said, "This is the way, and this is how we do this." And I just remember feeling relieved, but I also just was super nervous because I don't know what we're about to even do, what he's agreed to. So he directs me back to my hotel and tells me when to meet him and where to go, and describes what we'll be doing. So the next morning we meet on the banks of the Ganges River about 6 a.m. and we rent this old wooden boat. And we set out onto the Ganges River. And I was instructed to strip down and put on what's called a dhoti and a kava, which is just a dressing that you wear. It's a piece of cloth that goes over your shoulder, and it's very common to wear these things in India. And as his assistant is wrapping this garb around me, I could just begin to feel my heart start to beat faster and my pulse rise. And we sit down on the boat, and he tells me, you'll be repeating after me this series of prayers in Sanskrit, and we'll be putting flower petals and spices and fruits and vegetables, all these different wonderfully beautiful ceremonial things along with the ashes. So we go through this beautiful ceremony, and at the end, the pujari wraps this multicolored string around my wrist, and he tells me to allow this to fall off naturally. And that in doing so, I will be released of my mourning, of my sadness and this moment. And so it sinks in, and then he tells me something that catches me off guard. And he tells me that I'm going to need to bathe in the Ganges River. Now, I don't know if you know what's in the Ganges River, and you don't have to have read a lot of Lonely Planet books to know what's in there. But you had to know I wasn't getting in the Ganges River. And so I tell him straight up, I'm not getting in the Ganges River. Is there something else I can do? He says, yes, you can go back to your hotel and bathe or shower, but it's really, really important that you cleanse yourself after this. So we part ways. I give a very heartfelt thank you. And I'm walking through the lobby of the hotel, and I'm seeing that all these eyes of strangers are on me. This white man who's just performed this Santi Puja. And I'm feeling a little bit fraudulent, but I'm just overwhelmed with emotion in this moment. And I make my way up the long stairs to my hotel room, and I walk into my bathroom, and I sit down on this tile floor with all of my clothes on, and I turn on the hose that's just coming out of the wall, and I just melted under that water. And in that moment, I cried so hard. I poured everything that was in me out. But in doing so, I felt this absolute sense of freedom. It was a freedom I had never felt before in my whole life. I felt free of my fears, of my anxieties, and I felt overwhelmingly at peace that I had laid my best friend to rest exactly how he would have wanted me to. But it wasn't so much that he wanted me to dispose of his remains in this super specific way. It was more that he knew what held me back. And I know that in his wishes, he wanted me to be free. And that's exactly what happened. Thank you.
Michael, thank you for your story and your thoughtfulness. It means so much to hear your story and have you bring it to life. I know it's been in your heart for a long time.
Thanks so much, Megan, for letting me share it. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. We're lucky to have Michael as part of the Storytellers family every single day. He believed in the project before it was a national thing, so we're grateful to Michael all the time. I would now like to just take a second to thank some of the people who've made this show possible. Our colleagues at the Des Moines Register have helped coach and develop some of these stories. And as always, our colleagues at the Arizona Republic, later on in the show, you'll hear from one of the reporters themselves, helped coach and develop these stories. If you live in either Des Moines or Phoenix, consider subscribing. It's really good journalism, and it leads up to things like this. If you don't live in those cities, just enjoy all the hard work by those incredible reporters in those towns. With that, I'd like to welcome up our next storyteller. Kelly Buffalo Quinn has a story for us about a time when she lost her voice and found it again.
Hi, thank you, Megan. Thanks for having me. When I was 22, I became pregnant after a one-night fling. And I immediately knew I couldn't take care of this baby. The father had left for basic training by the time I found out I was pregnant, and he was weeks into his new life. I contemplated getting an abortion, but I eventually decided on adoption, and I'm very thankful I had that choice. I spent my first and second trimesters in relative solitude, largely ignoring my growing belly. I think it was kind of a way of a self-preservation. But by the third trimester, I knew I had to face this very real situation, and I began contacting adoption agencies. "What ethnicity are you?" asked a woman at one of the agencies. And I replied, "Native American." And then the line went silent. It was at that time, for the first time, that I learned of a law called the Indian Child Welfare Act, or ICWA. ICWA became a federal law in the 70s to preserve Native cultures and Native children that had been placed up for adoption. Before ICWA, there was a disproportionately high rate of Native children being removed from their homes, therefore being removed from their cultures. The woman said I would need permission from my tribal council to place my baby for adoption. So I called Meskwaki Family Services, which is my tribe's equivalent to DHS, and I told them about my plan. And they told me that as long as there were no objections to my adoption plan, that I was free to do what I felt I needed to do. With no objections that I knew about, I began looking for adoptive families. I read profiles of men and women who so desperately wanted to adopt a child. And I eventually found a family that I liked from Indiana. Mom, Tammy, owned a hair salon, and Dad, Gary, was a competitive archer who had just recently competed in Olympic trials. They sounded perfect, young, active, involved in their community. So we began a relationship, and I would call them after every OB appointment. We were in regular contact. Sometimes they called me just to talk to him. And I didn't want to get attached to the life that was growing inside of me, but I gave him a name anyway. Braven Wyatt. Braven because I needed him to be brave on this journey, and Wyatt because I've always liked that name. It turns out Tammy and Gary also picked out a name, Wyatt Joseph, and we took this as our sign that it was meant to be. I spoke to Braven all of the time, and I let him know what was going to happen, who his mom and dad were, and I told him over and over that I loved him very much and I only wanted the best for him. On May 24th, 2005, I went into labor, and my mom took me to the hospital. I remember laying there watching the opening of the 5 o'clock news, and 3 minutes later, an 8-pound baby was placed in my arms. It was exhausting and painful, but I think I was just relieved it was over, or so I thought it was. Hours later, Meskwaki Family Services showed up to the hospital room, and I was informed that my dad had raised an objection to my adoption plan. He went to our tribal council, and I was then stripped of custody because ICWA had come into play. The decision to strip me of custody was made by my father and a council of 7 men. My voice as a woman and as an enrolled tribal member and as a mother was effectively silenced. My blood ran cold and I felt nauseous. All of the pain and soreness from childbirth was nothing compared to the feeling of my heart shredding into pieces as my hours-old baby was stolen by my tribe. Gary and Tammy were holding Braven as Meskwaki Family Services gave us this news, and I watched as their hopes crumbled. Gary went mute, and Tammy sobbed those sobs that are so hard, no sound comes out. My relationship with my dad ended that day, and I decided to keep my son so that he would not be awarded custody. And I began the very slow process of reversing the tribal council's decision. I became increasingly angry as the weeks went on, and in my head, all I wanted was a good life for my child, and I was acting in the best interest of my child. I had done nothing wrong, but yet I felt like I was being punished. I spoke to a reporter about my case, and as soon as the tribal baby battle story aired, the floodgates opened. I was contacted by reporters all over the world. Oprah called me. I was the topic of discussion on Tucker Carlson's podcast. But most importantly, I became a topic of discussion within my tribe. I was ostracized and called names like baby seller. I was told I was not a real Meskwaki. This is not how we do things here, they said. But once, as I was walking into the tribal center for yet another tribal court hearing, I was stopped by a gugu. And gugu means grandma in our language, the Meskwaki language. And in our culture, all of the tribe's elder women are your grandmas. She grabbed my arms and she said, "You tell them, Gwesh." And Gwesh means little girl in Meskwaki. "You tell them, Gwesh. Don't be afraid to speak up for yourself. You let them know. You are a strong Meskwaki woman." After a few months, I really realized I could not raise this child on my own, and I eventually gave in to my tribe, and Braven was placed with the Meskwaki family. After that, I began a period of self-loathing. I hated myself, hated my skin, where I came from, my heritage. I no longer wanted to be Meskwaki, and I gave serious thought to disenrolling myself from the tribe. I fell into a lot of bad habits. I stuck around Tama and wallowed in addiction, in jail cells, and in hospital psych wards until I ultimately decided to leave for good. And so I moved to Des Moines at the end of 2010. And when I moved here, I could disappear. Nobody knew who I was. Nobody looked like me. It was like I was a ghost. But as time went on, I began to feel like there was a piece of me missing. It became draining being the only Native in my world. The fading into the background that I had loved before now just made me feel alone. In 2015, I learned of oil pipelines and the threat that they posed to Native communities. And I became involved in the No Dakota Access Pipeline protests. And I was so invested in what was going on in Standing Rock that I traveled there twice in the fall of 2016. The feeling of being around Native people from more than 400 tribes around the world, it filled me with warmth. One morning, as I was taking part in a water ceremony along the banks of the Cannonball River, everything just kind of hit me. I was there listening to a prayer being said in another Native language, and all I could think was, I wish I was home. And in that instant, my anger and my hate towards my community disappeared. It was like a switch flipped inside of me. Like the final piece of a puzzle was snapped into place. I realized that the culture that I had been running from all this time was actually what I needed to feel whole. Sitting in that hospital room 14 years ago, well, now 15 years ago, I was obsessed with the thoughts of my choices, the good that I wanted to do for my son, the better life that I wanted him to have. But there you have it. I was only thinking of myself. ICWA forced me to think of the tribe, to consider the many instead of just one. Instead of my needs, I had to think of our greater heritage, our culture, and our identity. We are the originals, and it's laws like ICWA and decisions like my tribal councils that protect our bodies and our descendants, our language, and our way of life. The preservation of Indigenous cultures is paramount, and with time and perspective, that's become so clear to me. 3 summers ago, my great uncle passed away. He was also the tribal chairman of the Meskwaki Nation. And I knew I wanted to go home to be part of the ceremony to honor him. And I was very anxious, knowing that this was going to be the first time around my family in so long. But one by one, all of my gukus greeted me, and my guku Betty came up to me and gave me a hug, and she said, "Welcome home, Gwesh." And a pure calm just flowed over me. It felt right. Home is a funny thing, isn't it? It's a roof and 4 walls, but to me, it's a lot deeper than that. To me, it's a native way of life. I wanted to remove the native from my son by sending him to a non-native family. But the beautiful irony here is that he was placed with an upstanding traditional family on the Meskwaki settlement. So he's being raised with all of our customs, our language, everything. And he plays lacrosse, which is very native, and I love it. Gary and Tammy kept in touch with me for a little while afterwards. I think it was because we were all just scared to let go. One of their final correspondences with me was to tell me that they had adopted infant twins, one girl and one boy that they named Wyatt. Last year, I was able to spend time with my son for the first time since he was a baby. It was right around his birthday, so I took him birthday shopping. He had just turned 14, so he picked out a Call of Duty game and a Nike t-shirt, and he also picked out a couple of matching bracelets for us. But none of those things were as important to him as his desire to know me and my family. He wanted to see pictures. He asked so many questions, which I was happy to answer. He wanted to connect to the part of him that was missing. He wanted to find his missing puzzle piece, which is a feeling that I deeply understand. It took me years to come to terms with ICWA, but it preserved my native child in the way that the law was meant to. And because of that, I know that he has a home, a true home among my people. Thank you.
Kelly, thank you so much for your story. Thank you for the vulnerability and thoughtfulness you've shared with us. And I want to honor of all the lessons I've ever heard on all the years of our stage, this is truly one of the most like complex, wrenching, and just like so beautifully expressed. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Thank you. It is an intense story and one with so many layers. We are so thankful to our colleagues in Des Moines for helping bring Kelly to our national stage this evening. And Kelly, we appreciate the investment you've made in this storytelling. If you guys are regular fans of the show, you know that all of our storytellers have volunteered their time to work with journalists in at least 22 of our Gannett markets, investing many hours working on their stories so that they can truly bring you a story from their heart to yours. It's a real blessing. So thank you, Kelly. Thank you to our colleagues. Our last story this evening is from our colleague here in Phoenix, Diana Nanez. Diana has been one of our coaches and one of the people who work on the Storytellers Project in Phoenix. And now she looks fabulous. Now she is a senior reporter in Phoenix. And this is a story about going home. Take it away, Diana.
Thank you, Megan. Really appreciate that. Thank you for that story. That was beautiful. Thank you for everybody's stories. Just really put us in a place where we can share. And I was supposed to be in a beautiful place with bookshelves and fancy things, but I have like 2 cats and 4 dogs and 2 dogs, and they wouldn't agree with it. So here I am in this room that my mijo used to have, and I want to share too. I had plopped down on the sofa, our old brown sofa. I was exhausted. My husband handed me a Cuba Libre, which is just my fancy Spanish language way of saying rum and Diet Coke. And my phone rang. And I picked it up. It was my cell phone. And I looked at it, and it was one of my news directors, Kathy. And I just kind of waited. It had been a really long week. It had been election week. And I had put out this huge story on voting and people being purged from the voting rolls. And all I wanted to do was just sit there in silence for like 24 hours and not move. So I waited, and I looked at the phone, and I remember that recently one of my colleagues had told me, Nanez, if you just don't pick it up and you call back like 5 minutes later, you get credit for calling back 5 minutes later, but they've already found someone. And I was like, oh, wow, where has that been all my life? Because when the phone rings, when the email comes in, when the editor comes walking down the newsroom hall, I always answer. And I always answer because that's just me, and it's work, but also not because it's just work. Like, journalism and answering has taken me to like cover people along the border and in Mexico and President Trump and Hillary Clinton and Michelle Obama and Barack Obama and just so many places. The Pope's visit, his first visit to the border in Juarez, which my Mexican Catholic grandmother had said was like the absolute pinnacle of journalism when I saw the Pope and got to cover him. As far as she was concerned, I could just go ahead and stop at that point. But I looked at the phone and I answered because that's what I do. And Kathy said, hey, I'm wondering if you've seen this fire in Northern California. It's really bad, and we're looking for some people who might be able to go. Our network across USA Today is sending different people to help. And I said, yeah, I have absolutely seen it. I've been watching it every day through the night. All my people are right there. Everybody is in Butte County, and I've been watching, scared to see if it would jump the Feather River and hit my people and my family. And she said that she had heard that too. And so she had thought that's why she would call me, and would I be willing to go? And I said, yes, absolutely, yes. So I packed my bag, booked a flight first thing in the morning, just threw in whatever I thought I needed, and then figured I could get what I needed there too, and it would all work out. I hop on the plane, and as I hop on the plane and I sit down and I'm looking out the window, I realize like this is the first time in a long time that I have been able to like just sit and think. And I'm looking out and I see the clouds and I'm thinking about my grandma and my grandpa and my home and my people. Because every single time that I went home to the Sacramento airport, I was going home to visit my grandma, my grandpa, my aunts, uncles, and cousins, because I'm Mexican and I have a lot of people there. And both my mom and dad's side live in this little teeny tiny Northern California town, Gridley in Butte County, and in the little tiny towns, farming towns, that are all a patchwork of families. I was thinking about my grandma, and I was thinking about how this would be the first time that I would go home and she wouldn't be there. My grandfather had passed a couple years ago, but she had just passed in February. And we moved away, and ever since we moved away, we lived in Minneapolis and Wisconsin and more than 30 years in Arizona, but we always went home to see my grandma. My grandma's home and the farm town where we lived and her roses that she grew. And that was always home. Didn't matter how long I was away. Didn't matter where we lived. And that this would be the first time I would go home and my grandma wasn't there. And I was always really close to my grandparents. My parents were teenagers when we had me, so we lived with them. I was so close that I actually called my grandma and grandpa Ama and Pa, and in Spanish, Ama and Pa means mom and dad. So I call my mom and dad, and my Ama and Pa, which means mom and dad. And I just figured, like, growing up, that everybody was lucky enough to have two sets of parents. I was so close that, when we lived with them, my ama would call me and tell me, ya vámonos, mija, ya es tiempo de dormir, ya es bien noche. And that meant it was really late. Let's go to bed, mija. Like, come on. And really late was probably more like 7:30, because my grandparents, my ama and pa, were farm workers, and they got up when it was dark and they would go work the fields. And even though I wanted to watch TV, I would still go. And I was so close that we would watch the same shows every night, even though my ama and pa would turn on Lawrence Welk, which I had absolutely zero concept for, because Lawrence Welk, and it was all this polka square dancing music, and it was all in English, and I could not understand the concept. But actually, if you listen, Lawrence Welk apparently is the exact same rhythm as banda music, which is I don't know what to tell you, but go on YouTube, check it out. You'll find out they're the same. So I had all these thoughts in my head about my ama's roses and family, and how this would be my first visit back. And that the last time I had seen her, she had actually come to Arizona. And in the more than 30 years that we lived in Arizona, she only visited one other time. And she had come in that past year, and she had said, I'm going to go. And she got on a plane all by herself. And my little 5-foot ama just never went any by herself. She didn't drive. She just was always with familia. But she came and she visited us, and I took days off work to be with her. I remember the first night, she said, Ya, mija, ya es bien noche, ya vamos a dormir. And again, it was like 7 o'clock. And I was like, okay, Ama. And I followed my little Ama into the room. We laid down in bed, just like I had done when I was a little girl. And we had set up a rosary for her. She always has her rosary and her Virgens de Guadalupe. And I laid there and I closed my eyes and I could hear her doing her rosary prayer. And I felt like I was back home. And as I had these thoughts in my head, time had passed and I look out and we're landing. And as we're landing, and it's morning, we land and outside it was just dark, just black. And I didn't understand like how this could be. Like I understood that it was the fire. I understood that it was this massive fire that had been on the TV news, that it was in paradise, that it was horrible. But you can't understand something until you see it sometimes. And to get off that plane and to see the darkness in the middle of the day, and the only thing I could say is it was like a zombie movie. You saw all these people wearing these masks and to protect their breathing. And I was just kind of launched into this sense of being in a different place. And I got the car, I rented it, get on the vehicle, headed home on the same roads I've headed home so many times before. And I got on my cell phone and I called the editors and I said, I'm here, what do you need? How can I help? And they were like, you can literally go to any shelter in Butte County. There are thousands of refugees. And that's what they called our families that escaped from Paradise. We don't have enough people and you can go anywhere. And I had planned that I would make a quick stop and pick up some roses, the kind my grandmother had grown in her garden, and stop by the Gridley Cemetery and visit her and my ba and my tias and tios and primos who had died too young. But there wasn't time for that. So I remember stopping to see if I could get a mask, but they were all out. And so I just grabbed a bandana. And as I'm there, any of you who've ever lived in a small farm town or a small town will know this, but you can't go anywhere without meeting people who know your people. And as I was talking to this woman, started interviewing her, and then she asked me, who were my people. And I said my last name, Nanez, and immediately she said, oh, I know Esther Nanez and Jose Nanez. And her husband had been a principal at the local school. And she shared to me what was happening and how she had had some family staying with her to give shelter to people. And when I left there, I decided that I would go to the Gridley Fairgrounds because I'd heard that there was a shelter there. And the Gridley Fairgrounds, for me growing up, like the Gridley Fairgrounds were like Disneyland. So for whatever weird, crazy reason, somebody had decided that our county fairgrounds of like our whole county of Butte, we would have the county fair in Gridley. And so it would be like the one time a year when everybody from like all the big cities, like 10,000 people would come in and they would visit the Gridley Fair at the Butte County Fairgrounds. And like, this was like the biggest deal. And we would go like every night. And I always remember my grandma would be like, just bring me back a corn dog. And we'd be like, Ama, like corn dog? Because like my ama cooked everything. And she had like her tamales and her menudo and her frijoles and her huevos. But like corn dog was not one of those things. So every year she's like, and just bring me back my corn dog. And the Gridley Fairgrounds was where we would go. And I remember my cousin Betty, she would sing. She had like gorgeous voice, and I wish I had this voice. And she would sing her Selena songs, and depending on like what it was, or mariachi songs, and where my tios would like go and win things like Smurf mirrors, like because it was the 80s and they had things like Smurf mirrors. And this was the Gridley Fairgrounds, like this was it. And I drove in, and as I'm driving through, like immediately I see all of these tents and all of these cars and blankets and Red Cross and people serving food and people wandering, just lost, and kids playing in the field. And it just looked like, I guess, what you would think an evac shelter looks like. And so I got out of my car and I walked up to this family, and I asked them if they would talk to me and share with me what had happened. And over the years as a reporter, like I talk to people, and sometimes they are excited to share their story, and I listen. But there's also a lot of times where I get the like, well, you're with the media and we don't want to talk to the media. And I understand that, and I try to explain. But this was a time where the only way I can explain it to you is there was almost no thought when someone came up and asked, would you share your story? People were still in shock, and they weren't speaking in what had happened a day ago. They were speaking as if it had just happened now. And this family had told me how they were at home and they kept wondering when they were going to get the call to evac, because supposedly they were going to do it in shifts, but then nobody was doing it, and they can see the fire growing. And so they just get in their car. They have 2 cars, their daughters, their grandkids, and they head down Skyway to escape Paradise. But as they head down there was fire on both sides of the road, this main artery out. And so they try and turn around so that they can go north. And they get stuck in this traffic jam with the fire pushing up from the forest area onto the gas station. And they look at this gas station and they are afraid they're going to die because the gas station is going to explode. And they're afraid everyone around them that's stuck in this traffic jam is going to die because this gas station is going to explode. And as they finally get out of this area, they have nowhere to go. And they're telling me, we didn't know where to go. We stopped, and it was night, and we just put our stuff out in the middle of the forest, just north of Paradise. And in the morning, as they're sleeping, police come and tell them, you have to get out. You have to get out now. The fire is here. And they hop in their car and they get out, and they tell me about how they just kept driving. They didn't even know any road to get out. And I took their story and I told them I would share it, and I took their phone and I told them I would text them. And it was like this over and over and over again. And I got on the phone and I asked them, where do you need me to go? I asked my editors, where do you want me to go? And again, they said, you can go anywhere. There's this, there's that. There's a meeting in Chico where they're supposed to talk about emergency plan because the fire was coming towards Chico. And so I get in my car and I drive out of the Gridley Fairgrounds and I drive down the main artery of Highway 99. And as I look, and it's night, and how many times I passed our Gridley Cemetery, and how many times my mama would do sign of the cross for our family that's there. And that's all I could do because I couldn't stop. I had to go to this meeting. I get to this meeting and I walk in, and it's at Chico State University where my dad had gone to school, and in this auditorium, and it was packed because everyone there was terrified, because the story had been the Paradise people didn't get any warning. And this is why there were thousands of people missing and so many dead. And so all they wanted to know was, would there be a warning for them? And as people walked up to the mic and said, what's happening? How will I know? How can I keep my family safe? There was this man with a baseball cap on, and he walked up and he was waiting. He waited in line. He walked up to the mic and he looks at the sheriff and he says, I know you're tired and I know you think you're doing enough, but you're not. We can't find our families. My grandfather is missing and I can't find him. I don't know where he is. I have called you. I have called everyone. I know you think you're doing enough. You need to do more. And when everybody was done speaking, I found this man and he'd given an interview to some TV station. And I waited and I asked him if he would share his story. And he pulled out a picture of his grandpa and he said, yes, will you put my grandpa on the news? And I told him I would do the best I could. And as we're sitting there talking, his phone rings, his cell phone. And it's someone who says, I saw you on the TV news and I think I know where your grandpa's at. You know, you got to go to this shelter. And he puts down the phone, takes the address, just like immediately goes, and he lets me follow him. And we drive in the night to the shelter, which was actually just a church because there weren't any shelters, because gyms and churches and homes and RVs and people just parked in like Walmart parking lots were everywhere. And you go into the church and there's people on cots, people of all ages, people on the floor because there wasn't enough room. And he walks in and I'm walking behind him and I see him looking around and it's really dark. It's hard to see. And I see him making his way towards one cot. This man is sitting there and he's got this old like cap on from like VFW or something like that for his veteran status. And I hear him say, Grandpa. And his grandpa looks up like nothing, like, oh, hey, it's you. And they give this big hug. And I wrote this whole story. And I remember leaving that church that night. And I hadn't even had time to book a hotel. So I called my aunt and she said, yeah, just come stay with us. And she'd go. And I got in late and I stayed up all night writing the stories that I had learned that day. And in the morning, I wake up early. I head back out again, just wherever you could go anywhere. And I remember at some point, somebody texts me that this man's story, finding his grandfather, when there were thousands of people missing, somebody found someone, had ended up on the front page of the USA Today. And I thought that was beautiful. But I thought it was beautiful because all I wanted was for people to understand that my people and my home, dozens were dead. This was the deadliest fire in the United States in 100 years. Thousands of people were missing. And if people could read that story and understand what was happening, because I always felt like if this was happening in LA or New York, somehow there would be more people here to help. So that day I spent all day at different places, in the Walmart parking lots, cars parked on the street, talking to people who needed help, needed home, needed something, were missing their people. And I remember someone had told me there was a mother who was looking for her daughter and would I call? And so I just, absolutely, I'll call. I got on the phone, I called, and she answered. And I said, hey, I'm sorry to bother you. I got your number. They said that you might want to talk to a reporter, that your daughter's missing. And immediately, like, she could hardly speak. Her husband gets on the phone and says, yeah, you know, our daughter's missing. And then the mom gets back on the phone and she says, I don't want to talk to you. And I said, I understand. She said, no, I don't want to talk to you, but I'm going to meet you wherever you want. And I'm going to bring a photo of my daughter. And I want you to share that photo because I need you to find my daughter. I said, I'll meet you. And we met in a parking lot of another church. And she pulled out the photo of her daughter. And she cried. And I took photos and tried to do my best. And it was like this day after day after day. And I would go home and my aunt and uncle would feed me. And if I had a few minutes, I would play with my cousin. And then I would just sit up all night writing, try to get a couple hours sleep and go back out. And I remember like day 3 or 4, I asked if I could stay and keep reporting. And day 5 or 6, I asked if I could stay and keep reporting. And then day like 7 comes and they're like, you know, we know that you need to take a break. So I agreed that I would leave home. I would leave home. And I booked a flight to leave on Sunday with the idea that I would take Saturday and Sunday off so that I could go and see some family and that I could go to the Gridley Cemetery, which is like this, imagine like the most beautiful cemetery that you can in your mind with oak trees and roses and every flower. And it's just been there, like, seems like forever. And all of everyone you love is there. That was my plan. But we got word that President Trump was going to come on Saturday. And he was going to tour the area. And so I said I wanted to help because that's what I wanted to do. And they sent reporters to be with Trump and cover his talk. And a lot of people went in that area who lived there went to see him. But I can tell you that none of the people who had been in the fire and had family in the fire and were missing people from the fire went. They were in cars trying to figure out where they were going to spend the night. They were in lines trying to see if they could get a FEMA trailer. They were just trying to figure out what they were going to do next. They didn't go. And so I didn't go. I stayed with them that day. And then I sat down when I got back and I wrote the stories. And in the morning when I woke up, this was my last day and it was Sunday. And I decided that I would go and have menudo with my aunt and my uncle who had taken such good care of me. And so we went to a little restaurant and we had menudo and I had tortillas. And a lot of people eat menudo with pan, these rolls of breads. But my mama would eat it with corn tortilla and she'd put a little bit of sal and some limon, and then she'd roll it up and then she'd dip it in the menudo. And that's how I ate my menudo, because that's how my mama ate her menudo. And every time we'd go home, we'd always have menudo because growing up, she would make it in this huge pot so we could all come together on Sunday as a family. And so I felt really good about this, that I was there with my tia and my tío and able to share this meal because I knew like this would make my mama happy. And I hugged them and I said goodbye. There was only a couple hours before I needed to be on the road to catch my plane out of Sacramento. So I got in my car and I sat at the wheel and I could go left, south to Gridley, see my mama and bring her roses, see my pa and all my family and all my people, all my gente. Or I could go right and go to Paradise. And in all the days that I'd been there, I actually never went to Paradise. All the reporters that were coming in nationally after days, everybody wanted to get to Paradise because if you lived there, you couldn't go in. It was only emergency personnel or reporters who had their press badge. But I didn't go because I stayed with my people and trying to share their stories so they would get help. And I decided that I wanted to think about what I was going to do. But before I could even think about what I was going to do, I went north to Paradise. I had heard this story over and over on every day that I was there, that people were saying that the Paradise Cemetery had survived, that the whole town had burned, but Paradise Cemetery had survived. And I wanted to see. People were worried about their people in the cemetery, and they wanted to know, and I wanted to see. So I'm driving down Skyway. This is the same road that I heard over and over people were trapped on, people died on the side of the road as the fire just came too close. And all along the rolling hills, like towards the river, it's just black on each side. And I could see every story that people had told me, but I could see it looking out my window. And I had put on Yahoo Maps, and I saw the gas station that the family had told me that they were worried was going to explode. And I made my right towards Paradise Cemetery. And I'm driving on this road that really becomes more forest than anything else, as houses are kind of like packed in there. And I see, as I'm about to get to the cemetery, to the left, there's a church across the street, and it's just completely burnt to the ground. And I see the arches, these like big metal arches, Paradise Cemetery. And I drive through, and as I drive in, it was like this lush, gorgeous, beautiful garden. Nothing had burnt. You could see on each side the buildings and the land were charred all the way up to the edge of the cemetery, and then it just stopped. And along the other side and every edge, it would just stop. The rest of Paradise, and the only way I can explain this, because you have to go look it up, looked like a bomb had gone off. Cars, power lines, just everything. But here was Paradise Cemetery. Perfect. The roses, the oak trees hanging over, headstones with angels, and I'm driving around, and everything just looks so peaceful. And then I see this car, and it's like in the middle of this cemetery, over 4 headstones. So I get out of my car, I go look. I'm looking through the window, and I see a guitar and a blanket and a bottle of Jim Beam. And nothing else, just packed with things that somebody must have put in quickly to leave with, a laptop. And there's nobody there. And I'm wondering, what happened to this person? Because I'd heard these stories that it was so dark with smoke that people couldn't see, and they would crash their cars. And then all of a sudden I hear this vehicle, and I look over, and there's a woman driving, and I flag her down, and she stops, and I ask her, who she is, and she says that she works for the mortuary, and that they were part of the crew that got to come back. And they got to come back to help identify bodies and bury bodies, because 85 people died in that fire. And we sit and we talk, and she tells me how she hopes that Paradise will come back, that the people of Paradise will come back, and that this was her first day back, and she drove straight to the cemetery because she needed to know it was okay, if it had survived. So I leave, and I'm late, I've got to rush to the airport. And I get on the plane, and I'm sitting there thinking, and I'm sitting there resting, and I'm thinking about how I hadn't seen my grandmother. And I get home, and I get off the plane, and I immediately sit down and try to write, because I want people to know about Paradise Cemetery, and I file my story, and I go to sleep in my own bed, and I wake up in the morning, and I log on, and I'm looking at Facebook and looking at my story. Was everything okay? Did everything get put properly in the photos that I had taken of Paradise Cemetery? And as I'm looking online, I see in these Paradise survivors and in these like missing Paradise groups that I had joined, there was a woman that had posted that she was very, very sorry. And she felt really, really bad because she knew that people were missing and she knew that people were dead, but that her brother and her grandparents and her people were buried at Paradise Cemetery. And she'd moved away and she just wanted to know if they were okay. And I immediately log on. I immediately write back that I've seen it, Paradise Cemetery survived. And I send her the link to the story with the photos. And almost instantly, she replies, like instantly, "Thank you. I felt really bad. I know people have lost their people, but that's where my people are." And to this day, I guess 2 years, I cannot tell you that I can say that I know I did the right thing, not going to Paradise, not going to Gridley Cemetery and bringing my grandmother roses. But I can tell you that I got to tell someone the Paradise Cemetery survived and that their people were okay.
Diana, thank you so much for your story. I would like to bring up all of our storytellers now to thank them and say goodnight. We really appreciate Michael's story, Aaron for being with us, Jim for being with us, and Kelly. Thank you all so much for sharing your lessons learned and your hearts with us. Thank you everyone for watching. We look forward to seeing you again soon.